Okay, let's get started, everyone. Good afternoon. Or it could be good morning, or it could be good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Michael Pisarek, and welcome to this session. So in this session, we're going to talk about information architecture, the building blocks. And I wanted to really concentrate on information architecture because it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. But also another thing that I found working with customers and with clients, that this is one of their biggest challenges when creating a SharePoint intranet. SharePoint now, especially SharePoint Online, it's beautiful, it's fast, it's easy to use, but how to structure your content, how to make sure that your content is intuitive for all of your users and your content authors can be really difficult. So that's what we're going to cover over the next 50 minutes. As always, if you have any questions, and we do, and I would love to hear some of them, feel free to use the Q&A panel. I can't see that, but I'm sure you guys are all experts in how to use that. So let's get going. So before we begin, a little bit about myself. So my name is Michael Pisarek. I am the CEO and co-founder of Orchestry Software. This is a new startup that we are currently working on launching in the next couple of months. And really, Orchestry is an adoption platform for Office 365. We think as more organizations adopt Office 365, and particularly teams, with all of the different capabilities, with all the different tools, it can be a little bit difficult to understand what to use when as an end user. And Orchestry is going to help with that. So soon we'll have a website up. Soon we'll have a product sheet up. I think you're going to love it. I think the product is going to be great. But if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me also. Before that, I was a 6 times Microsoft SharePoint MVP. And my first company was a rather well-known SharePoint intranet company before we got acquired a couple of years ago. So lots of experience within the SharePoint space. I think I've been working with SharePoint and SharePoint Online, or just SharePoint in general, probably for the last 10 years. Seems like a long time now when I think about it. But probably for the last 7 years, really concentrating on the intranet space. And in the previous organization that I was at, we were really lucky enough to work with some really amazing clients, clients ranging from maybe 30 people to the biggest intranet we did was close to 175,000 users. So a whole breadth and gamut of organizations in scale and size and scope. And we were lucky enough as well, not just to build intranets for organizations, but a few of our organizations actually won a number of awards. So 2 of the organizations we work with won Nielsen Norman Intranet Awards, which are kind of the Oscars, I think, of the intranet space. So we were super proud of that. A lot of those experiences I'll be sharing around those as well. And then finally, I always get this question where the accent is from. So I was born in Poland. I grew up in Australia, and for the last close to 12 years now, I've been in Canada. I'm coming to you live from Vancouver, Canada. You probably can't see behind me, but it is here. This doesn't happen very often. If you're in Seattle, our weather is very much like Seattle, but it's a beautiful sunny day here. And once again, super happy to be able to present this to you. So what are we going to talk about today? A few things. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is information architecture in a kind of broader sense. Once again, it really helps, I think, to set the stage in terms of what is information architecture. Is it about metadata? Is it about content types? Is it about columns? Is it about libraries? We're going to talk about all of those things and really understand what good information architecture is and how you can craft a good structure for your users around that. The next thing we're going to delve down a little bit deeper into information architecture specifically for SharePoint intranets. So particularly I'm going to be concentrating on SharePoint Online, but a lot of the tools, techniques, and everything else can be used for really SharePoint on-prem and really any intranet sort of platform that you have. We're going to talk about some best practices. I'm going to share some of the secrets and some of the novel things we used to do when we used to work with organizations around how to structure content, how to gather requirements, and how to make sure ultimately that you're creating a structure for your intranet that works for everyone, okay, and is intuitive and people can find content, because that's really the whole point, I think, of a great intranet. Employee communications is super important, engagement is super important also, but really if your users can't find the content that they're after really quickly and really easily, then it's all for nothing. Then we're going to talk about some tools and techniques. There is a lot of tools that you can use to come up with information architectures. So things like site structures and navigation, and even how your pages are laid out. These are things that we use all of the time. They're probably less used, I think, in the Microsoft consulting space. But if you go and you do a large-scale website, let's say Nike.com, you know, there is a process and there's tools that they use to come up with that taxonomy, come up with how the structure looks, come up with what those labels are, so you can find things. And you can apply those same tools and the same techniques to your SharePoint intranet for some really fantastic results. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about some pragmatic intranet architecture activities. So how do I go about this process? How do I go around gathering requirements, understanding my user needs, and then ultimately creating a structure that's going to work? So hopefully that's what you're here for. We're not going to get super technical. We're not going to get super nerdy. There's no custom code in here. There's no PowerShell. There's none of that stuff. But like I said, we will go kind of between different levels. So both of, you know, the intranet side and also a little bit of SharePoint action as well. So first, let's talk about what information architecture is. So information architecture, this is the broad level definition, is the art and science of structuring, label, and categorizing content. Or as I would like to explain it to people, information architecture is making sure that your users can find what they need and when they need it as quickly as possible. And in a broader sense, there's a few things that help you define an information architecture. There's a few elements. And those elements are users, so understanding what your users are doing, context within your organization. This is really important, particularly when you're talking about organizations. The way that organizations talk about things can be very, very different. In some organizations, they refer to people as clients that they work with. In some organizations, they refer to it as members, for instance. So these subtle things, depending on how your organization thinks about information, can really change how you structure your content. And then, of course, we're going to talk about content, probably one of the most important parts of information architecture. So let's talk about these three things so you kind of get an understanding of what you need to understand first before you start to build any sort of IA. So the first one, surprisingly enough, is your users, right? You really need to understand your users to create a structure that's going to work for them. So common questions like who are the users of the intranet? What information is important to them? This is something that's really, really interesting. We always found during intranet and digital workplace projects, there was almost a tension between the owners of the intranet and the consumers or the end users of that intranet content. More often than not, intranet owners would be someone like corporate communications, and to them, you know, news, events, announcements is super, super important. But then when we went and asked users what's important to them, they still found that content important, but more often than not, they wanted to be able to find policies, procedures. They wanted to do common tasks like maybe request a holiday or a vacation day. So some of those things didn't quite align. So really making sure that you understand what your users want and need can be really, really powerful in making sure that you can craft that case with your intranet team to create a structure that's going to work for your users also. The next thing, number three, is what tasks are people trying to compete? Once again, we want to understand what people are trying to do on the intranet. More often than not, what we try to do is come up with what we call a task-based or a user-centered design for information architecture. So we want to make sure that we structure that content not how the organization wants it to be represented, but how users think about that content. And one of the ways that you can do that is understanding what types of tasks there are. You want to understand where your users are physically located. Now, the reason for that is if you're a large multinational across different offices, different geographies around the world, they might have very, very different needs. And finally, how are they going to access the intranet also? Is it going to be through a desktop device? Is it going to be through a mobile device? Is it going to be work from home now as well? So some of the customers that we have worked with, as soon as they went from a work from home sort of setting, they found that their intranet really wasn't working for them, because typically people would use the intranet, but if they couldn't find something, they would go and walk over and ask someone for instance. But with work from home, everyone being a little bit more distributed, they really needed to make sure that all of that content was in a good location. Probably the biggest tip I can give for you is that, you know, we've been involved in a lot of intranet projects, and I'm sure you've been that, where you get 10 really smart and intelligent people in a room. Let's call them the intranet team. You probably have done the right thing. You've got multiple people from multiple different departments as well. But then just getting 10 people to try to come up with the structure for an organization of 500, 5,000, 50,000, that doesn't really make much sense. So getting as much user input, as much user validation as possible is really, really valuable. There's a number of techniques and tools that we used to use. So things like surveys. We used to do something called task-based analysis, where we would basically ask people, you know, when you get on the internet, what are the 5 most common things that you're trying to do? And more often than not, we never found that it was the things that intranet teams thought that users were doing. Very rarely people say, well, I go to the intranet always to find news. More often than not is I go to it to find tools that I need to do my job, so policies, procedures, forms, templates. More often than not was I go there to put in holiday requests, expenses, travel reimbursements, those types of things also. So once again, having an understanding of your users is super, super important. The next thing is around context. This is a really interesting one. So context is really specific to the organization that you work with. It's one of the reasons that you can't just take you know, a navigation structure and move it from organization to organization and hope that that's going to work. Context is understanding really those, I guess, nuances within your organization. So a couple of things to consider. Is there a specific line of business content to highlight, or is there particular initiatives that you might want to highlight as part of your intranet? Now, for a lot of organizations, you might have a particular initiative that you're pushing that can impact your information architecture, right? Maybe that piece of content doesn't live buried down 2 or 3 levels. Maybe it goes up to the top navigation level, for example. The next is the communication style of the organization. So communication style refers to, are things very formal? So do we call news news? Or are they informal? So maybe we call more kind of communication types of things announcements, or is it a mix? And the reason that that's important is particularly in terms of the labels. So how you structure your top level navigation, the labels that you use are going to be really impacted by that communication style. There's more formal labels and there's less formal labels that you can use, and we'll talk about that shortly. Of course, are there any labels or terminology that are familiar to users also? So once again, acronyms is a really common thing. A lot of organizations love to use acronyms in their navigation structure or on top of or as part of, you know, navigation areas within their intranet also. And then the last thing is there any organizational culture, change management, or lessons learned. A big thing that we found, and if you've done any of this work, you probably have found this as well, how your content is structured on your intranet, particularly on your homepage, can get super political, right? Because everyone thinks that their stuff is super important and everyone wants their stuff on the homepage. So understanding really, you know, some of the organizational culture pieces, who's in the room, whose content is actually more important than not, can be really important. It all comes down to this context. And then the third and the last one is content, right? So biggest tip probably I can give is you really need to have a good understanding of the type of content that you have within your intranet. So typically intranet content produced by a few authors for many readers. If you're looking at more collaborative type of content or content that's secure and actively be worked on, there's typically other areas within your digital workplace for that. So maybe you're using teams and their private teams, or you're using you know, SharePoint team sites with private groups. On your intranet, you don't want to have in-flight content. You want to have final and authoritative content. So, you know, if you go to your intranet and you go to one of these sites, which is public and available for everyone, that copy of the vacation policy, that's the one that I should be looking at. You don't want to go and do a search for vacation policy and find 37 copies, right? You don't know which one is the authoritative version. Typically, there's, you know, no or low security there, so most of the content is open. You want to have approval processes for your content that goes on your intranet, and you're going to hear me talk about this a lot. we love and we feel that you want a task and not a department-based structure, right? This whole idea of having your intranet IA, your navigation or your site structure based around departments really doesn't work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. So now that we've talked about intranet kind of information architecture in a broader sense, let's talk about it more in terms of the SharePoint side. And when you're developing a SharePoint intranet, there's a lot you can do about IA, but really it comes down to three main things. So the first thing is around your site structure, and your site structure feeds into your navigation also. So think of site structure as both how that content is going to be structured within your intranet in terms of the sites or the site collections that is going to store that content. The second is around tags and categories, what we call metadata. So metadata is information about content. It allows you to add additional information for different types of content that you're using, and it can be a really powerful tool. So I know that I think before SharePoint Online, before Office 365, metadata was a really hot topic, and people used to love to, especially consultants would come in and they would do these huge information architecture taxonomy engagements. What typically would happen, you would come up with something which was just way too crazy. So every time someone uploaded a document to a team site, there was like 97 different pieces of individual metadata that have to fill out. Of course, it drove people crazy. No one would fill it in, and you're kind of in a worse position than you were off previously. But there is a balance there. There's a balance of understanding the type of metadata that you need. And particularly from an intranet perspective, you're using that metadata to drive certain things. Maybe you're using that metadata so you can target content to your users. Maybe you're using that metadata so you can aggregate content across different areas also. We'll give you some examples of that. And then the last one is what we call landing pages. So in SharePoint Online, in your intranet, you're going to have pages that people land on. It could be a home page for a hub site. It could be a home page for a communication site. It could be a team, or it could be the new SharePoint home functionality. And how that page is structured, what's on that page, how it's configured, how it looks, the pieces, once again, that's part of that information architecture. So the site structure kind of defines how all of that stuff is organized. The tags and categories is going to define how that content is basically identified, and those landing pages is around how you're going to present that content. So three different things. Now, one of our dirty little secrets, and I think it's a consultant dirty little secret, is that the more intranet projects we did, the more commonalities we found between how people natively thought about information. And it really was surprising to me after doing, probably, like I said, close to 80, I think, intranet projects over the previous 5 or 6 years, in terms of how familiar or how similar the way that people thought about information on their intranet. And this was regardless of size, regardless of vertical, regardless of industry, regardless of country. And this is what we found. And this actually is not just us. This is kind of something, if you look in the some of the Nielsen Norman Intranet awards, you see this content is kind of grouped pretty in a pretty similar fashion. So when we talk about intranet content, we found that we're grouped into these 6 buckets. Now, it's not going to be exactly what it is, but at least this gives you a really good starting point. So the first type of bucket of content was all the stuff for me as an employee within the organization. We call it the My Working Life type of content. Benefits, compensation, expenses, training, that type of content that's relevant to me as an employee within the organization. Now, typically that content is from a number of different departments. Most of it's from HR, some of it can be from finance, but that kind of content related to me working as an organization was the first bucket. The second bucket was really how we worked, or tools and resources. So what do I need as an employee to do my job? Policies, procedures, forms, tools, templates, applications, all of those things fall under this how we work sort of category. Once again, if you notice, these aren't categorized by the department that owns them. It's really categorized by the type of content. So that's the second type. And we really found that resonated a lot with people having an area on their intranet, maybe it was called tools and resources or something else, where they can get access to all of the policies or all of the procedures, regardless of which department or who owned the content, and then using something like metadata, they could easily filter the content through there as well. The third bucket was around who we are. So who are we as an organization? So vision and values, strategy, board members, our history. We have our values there also. All of that information about who we are as an organization and what we're trying to do. That's an area where I think it's really important to have good content on the intranet. It's also content that typically you'll find exists on the public facing side also, but I really think it's great to have that on the intranet side. And the reason for that is once again, you can get into, you can structure that content in a way that makes more sense. And also you can have content that you might not want to share out on your internet. But like I said, vision, values, mission, initiatives was another one, really kind of understanding who we are. The fourth one is a very traditional one. So we call this what's going on. You can call it corporate communications, but it's basically all the stuff that, kind of news, events, announcements, and what we call spotlight items. So when we were working with end users in particular, the types of stories they wanted to hear on the intranet were less stories from the organization, but more stories about the organization. So what I mean by that is one of the pieces of content that we found really resonated with people was what we called spotlights. So employee spotlight, brand spotlight, new starters, people retiring, that type of content about, users or, people within an organization really resonated really well. And it's all kind of grouped into this kind of corporate communications type of buckets. So news, events, spotlights, that type of thing was that fourth bucket. The fifth bucket was around shared services or departments. So here is where you start to get into more of that traditional, old school intranet style of thinking, where you have various, sites or site collections for your various departments. Now, like I said before, you need to have an area for your departments to talk about who they are, what they do, the services that they offer. But once again, that doesn't mean that your intranet should be based, or that structure should really be based around how your departments or your shared services are organized also. And then the sixth one is really about line of business. And this is the one that was most different between all organizations, because your line of business is what you do. So if you're a product-based organization, more often than not, you would have some part of your intranet around products. So it could be things like knowledge base and sales collateral. It could be technical information also. So once again, they're the type of things we saw around from a product-based scenario. If you're a services-based organization, it could be, once again, a knowledge-based, best practices, tools, techniques, and templates that you use to provide for your particular services. And if you're a project-based organization, typically project-based organization and service-based organizations go hand in hand. But if you're a project-based organization, we found a lot of customers love to have, an area for projects on their intranet. So what projects are available, who's working on what, but then also all of the tools and resources that you need to run a project successfully. Once again, tools, templates, techniques, best practices was super popular also. So we wouldn't recommend that your intranet navigation should have like my working life and how we work and who we are and what's going on. But this is the first step. This is the first step to kind of talk about how this content can be structured. And then when we talk about some labels, this is where it gets interesting, because these are the types of labels that we found organizations using at that top level. So my working life, really common things that we found. So employee essentials was one, working at whatever the corporation is called, and then working here. So that would be the top level category. And then underneath, there's all the other subcategories of content. How we work. So tools and resources, work tools, toolbox. These are common labels that we applied to that also, which worked really well. Who we are. So this one's pretty easy. About us, our firm, company info, pretty simple. What's going on was a pretty simple one as well. So once again, like news and announcements, news and events, corporate comms, it could just be news. And then the last one, shared services, some of the labels that people used were things like departments, business units, or our organization. So these are kind of labels that we found people used really, really commonly. So what this would look like is something like this. So if we're looking at SharePoint Online, a modern communication site here with a hub, you could have Contoso, Employee Essentials, Tools and Resources. And notice then when I click on Tools and Resources, I get a further subcategorization of content. So under Tools and Resources, things you might probably find are forms, policies, procedures, reports, templates, applications, locations, and we've got forms there twice. I apologize for that. And then underneath those, you could have third level items also. So, under forms, you might have agreements because you use that a lot, maybe updated and most popular also. And these could lead either to individual documents or to further sub-pages also. In terms of some IA best practices, so for that top level navigation, so the top level piece and really the second level piece here, there's some things that you want to consider. So you want to label things clearly. So don't use taglines or acronyms. We worked with an organization and, marketing got involved. And of course, marketing people are very creative in terms of how they think about content. So they wanted to make that top level navigation very, very creative. So instead of calling things policies, they call it the policy pagoda, right? It's a kind of, more of a jokey, I guess term. But the thing is, it's fun to do that. But when we tested these things, is no one actually knew, where anything was. So use pretty standard labels for things. Don't try to get too smart. Use short names. People just don't read anymore. They scan, and there's another rule around that we'll talk about as well. So tools and resources is one of the things that is a little bit tricky. You don't want to have an IA where you have tools and resources, and then you've got benefits and something else there, and having constant ands there. You want to make sure, but tools and resources works well, but you want to have shorter top level navigation names. Once again, you want to organize content by type and not by ownership. We'll be harping upon that a lot. And you want to do something called mutual exclusivity. So at the top level and even the second level, you want to make sure that you're not confusing users with similar labels. So an example of that is you wouldn't have news and announcements, right? So a news thing and then an announcements top level navigation structure, because people aren't just going to be able to differentiate what is a news and what is an announcement item. And you want to make sure that you provide multiple pathways to content. So this was something that I think a lot of people misunderstand. Not everyone in your organization is going to look for content the same way. You want to make sure that you want to make sure that for the majority of cases, they can find content through there, but you also want to give people multiple pathways. And you can do that by cross-linking to content on pages. In some cases as well, we've seen this work. You might have in the second or third level of your navigation, the same label, okay, as well. So that can work also depending on how you think about content. What we found with trends is there's definitely a trend now to have more of a deeper information architecture. So going down to 3 levels rather than a wider one. So probably, I think, when I started in Intranet, the top level navigation items were like 7 to 10. Right? You had this massive top level navigation piece. It was really confusing to find content. Now people are starting to shrink that down a little bit, and probably because of the rise of mega menus, people are going down and saying, we might have only 5 to 9 items at the top there, but we might have some second and third level pieces. And then later on down the line, of course, as well, when you jump onto a page, you can use that landing page for navigation also. Like I said, what we found is there's something called Miller's magic number, which I totally agree with. So Miller's magic number is 7 plus or minus 2. It's basically the number of things your brain is going to remember when you scan something quickly before you forget. So the reason that you want to have between 5 and 9 top level navigation items is if you have more than that, by the time users scan and get to the end, they've forgotten the first one, right? And Miller was, I think he was a professor, he's someone very passionate about numbers, and he did a whole bunch of research, and it's actually true. So make sure that those top level navigation items don't get too crazy. Couple of other things as well. We found that less but more accurate taxonomy is really, really valuable. So don't try to put everything in that navigation menu, right? Especially on that third level, the screenshot I have here, there's probably a little bit too much here. There's 5 items, but we've seen customers who try to under benefits and compensation, they'll have 30 items under that. It just doesn't work. Technically, it's possible. It just means that your mega menu is just way too mega. It looks way too big, and it's really difficult for people to scan that as well. And then with the site structure, or with this content, as I talked about, it doesn't equal your intranet navigation there, but it really helps inform it. So it really helps you understand what you're supposed to be doing and how. And then from a SharePoint perspective, you've got a whole bunch of out-of-the-box tools that you can use. So typically that top-level navigation would be defined at that hub site level. So you can then move across various other sites and have that top-level nav. Once again, because we're using SharePoint Online, everything is going to be a site collection through here. And the new SharePoint home sites can also be the starting point of that intranet experience. And then finally, around departments. So I know I've kind of harped upon this a little bit. So in terms of departments, once again, your departments need to have a place on your intranet, but it doesn't mean that your content should be structured around your departments. And the reason for that is departments, their names change frequently, they merge or they're updated. But the biggest thing for that is most users don't think about content in terms of who owns it, which is really a department structure. They think about content in terms of the type of content that they're looking for. So if I'm looking for, let's say, a benefits form, more often than not, a user will say, I'm looking for a form. So where are all the forms? And then can I filter on them? As opposed to saying, well, I'm looking for a benefits form, who owns it? Maybe it's HR, maybe it's the benefits team. Okay, I'll go to that particular area and I'll start to look for that content. It's a really subtle thing, but it's very, very powerful also. So that what that would look like is, let's go to an intranet. There we go. So this is a little bit of a demo environment here. So this is SharePoint Online. Let's do a bit of refresh here. So at the top here, we've got our kind of hub navigation, as we've talked about. So we've got Contoso, Employee Essentials, Tools and Resources. You can see here, we've got our forms, our policies, procedures, reports, all of this type of stuff. We've got our news. We've got our how do I put this in here. This is something that I really, really like. We saw a lot of organizations putting in an area called how do I, which is just task focused, right? So just really, how do I submit an expense claim? How do I do whatever else? And kind of have maybe the top 20 tasks that people do in one area. We found that was really powerful. And of course, with the shared services of the departments area, this is where you have your actual department pieces. And then we have our top level navigation here, and then we have our second level navigation through here. Now, personally, I really dislike the way that SharePoint Online does this. This to navigation thing flying out is, to me, it's a little bit crazy, but it's just the way that it does it out of the box. There's plenty of tools and products out there that can change that. It is much better than it was, though, because in previous versions, it wasn't very good. So if I'm in the marketing area, though, let's say I move from shared services to retail, you can see what's going to happen is this hub level navigation is going to stay across the top, and I have my pieces through here as well. So once again, this consistent navigation, let's go back to marketing here, can be easily achieved through SharePoint Online. I'm not going to get too much into this, but once again, pretty simple to do. So let's talk about the next thing, metadata. Big fan of metadata. Metadata used to be a passion of mine. I know that sounds really strange to everyone here, but to me, metadata is really what can drive a great intranet, because intranets are going to change. Your organization is going to change. So if you just structure your content based on where it is, you don't have as much flexibility. Now, what gives you that flexibility is metadata. Metadata can provide structure to your content independent of the physical location where it is. That's very, very powerful, because that means that you can do a number of different things. You can aggregate content, you can target content, and you can filter content. Now, if you don't know what metadata is, in the SharePoint side of things, it's basically adding columns to things like lists and libraries and pages, so you can categorize that. So some pretty common example is up the top here. We've got a documents library. We've added a custom column called document type, where people can filter on things. And then down below, we have a pages library, and we added a piece of metadata called topics. But what metadata allows you to do is, I think, a number of powerful things. The first thing from an intranet perspective is metadata can also be used to target content. So an example of that would be, let's just say that on your pages library, you add one additional piece of metadata, and you call it topic or topics. And you add some values there. So strategy, new starter, any of that type of stuff. Then what you can do, you can allow users to say, or you can target that content to users. So if you've got, let's say, a topic piece of metadata across your entire intranet platform, you can then create a roll-up page which shows you which shows you all of the stuff related to a new starter automatically, right? And it could be from different areas. I'll show you that in just a moment. But the uses for metadata: targeting content, so targeting news pages by topic, business unit, location. You can show personalized content also. So you can say, just show me content based on my user attributes. So a good example would be show me policies based on my position, and also allows you to filter and target that content through there. The next thing, or the next two things around metadata, is around aggregating content. So this is something that's really powerful. What you can do is you can allow, let's say, your departments or their content authors to offer their content in their department areas. But as long as they add the correct metadata, you can then use something like a highlighted content web part, and then you can say, well, show me all of the content across the entire intranet that's targeted for new starters, for example. And that could be anywhere. It doesn't mean that you have to be in the same site that new starter content is in, but it allows you, if that makes sense, to build some really dynamic content and to use content and to show content independent of the location where it is. The other thing that it's also going to allow you to do is to filter content. So allowing your users to filter content manually within document libraries, create views to quickly find content, and then also search-based experiences. So great search, in my mind, really depends on metadata, but you can make that super, super easy and super simple. Finally, what we get asked is, what's that minimum set of metadata, right? So what should people have as a minimum? And I can tell you a couple of things from experience. If you come back with, to your content authors, your users, that every time someone uploads a piece of metadata, they have to, a piece of content, they have to attach 7 pieces of metadata, no one is going to do that, right? So we like to keep it as a maximum of 3 things. That's really where people, I think, draw the line at adding additional information. There's a lot of tricks that you can use with SharePoint to automate the process of metadata. Project Cortex is coming up a lot around. I think Project Cortex could be extracting that metadata automatically for you. But here's some examples of things that we found. So one of the first ones was around topics or tags. This idea that for any type of content, someone can apply a topic or a tag to it. Now, topics could be very broad-based. They could be controlled in nature, what's called a taxonomy. More often than not, we found that organizations use something called a folksonomy. So a folksonomy is essentially users can either choose existing metadata or add their own. So content authors, can choose existing metadata or add their own. And then you can use topics or tags to roll up content. So another example, let's talk about the new starter example, is I can go look for content for new starters, and maybe there's some documents in marketing, maybe there's some stuff in HR for new starters, maybe there's a news article from a project for new starters. As long as it's tagged with that topic tag, I can roll that up in SharePoint really, really easily. The other thing that we also found, which is a really good piece of metadata, is around more the work area. So product, service offering, knowledge area. So tagging any piece of content with a product or a service or a knowledge area and aggregating that content together. So if you're working on, let's say, a product, you might have different departments that are responsible for different types of documentation. As long as they all tag that particular piece of metadata or that product there, you can create a really beautiful aggregated page that says, here's all of the information about bicycle 747 from all around the intranet. You don't have to do that manually. That's all going to be automatically for you. Document type is a really common one. Now, document type is not, whether it's a PowerPoint, a PDF, you get that for free, but rather the type of content that it is: presentation, template, proposal, contract, all of that type of stuff. And then news and announcements category. So being able to add further news and announcements pieces also. Let's talk about the last thing, which is landing pages. So we talked about the site structure. We talked about tags, categories, metadata, and then landing pages. So when I talk about landing pages, they're basically a landing page is any web page that a visitor can land at and helps them guide them through the section of the site and give them quick access to the information that they need. In SharePoint Online, there's a number of different places, well, a number of different landing pages, essentially. There's the new home site functionality. That's a landing page. It's probably going to be the main one. Hub sites, of course, are landing pages. Team sites have landing pages and communication sites are landing pages also. And the idea with these landing pages is not to show every single thing that's within that area. So if I have a team site, I don't want to have like every single thing on the landing page. So all of the news, all of the announcements, all of my documents, all of that sort of stuff. So there's this massive like 7-meter long page that someone has to scroll down. It should give me the ability to, at a glance, find what I need, promote the most important content also, and also give me enough of what's called an information set to be able to drill down deeper into the site if I need to. And there's a few best practices around landing pages also. So the first one is what's called the F pattern. Now, if you've ever noticed, why is the most important stuff on any website, pretty much any website, always on the top left? And the reason for that is that that's how people look. So people look at content in an F pattern. So they go from the top left, they scan across the top, then they go down to the second row, and then they go down that way. Now, this I think is only for languages which are left to right. I think for right to left languages like Arabic, I assume it would be the opposite way. I don't know. That's just my assumption. But this gives you a good idea of kind of understanding, where the most prominent content should be. We used to talk in web design about having stuff above the fold, but now you can use this F pattern also to understand how to place your content. And then the final thing is around kind of what we found worked really well is having dynamic content. This was really important for organizations that didn't have too much content. This idea that when a user lands on one of these landing pages, they can see things like recently updated documents or guides, most viewed, most liked, recently modified. And the nice thing around this as well is if you've got the metadata in place, you can see all of these pieces really, really simply. So we've covered a lot, right? We've covered a little about our IA, what it is and how it is. Let's talk about the activities, because it's all good talking about how this works, but the big question around information architecture is this. It's the number one question. We spent a whole bunch of time, a whole bunch of work, hundreds of thousands of dollars, very smart people trying to work this out. How are we going to be sure that people can find content on your intranet before you launch or you build anything? Turns out there is a way. So these are the activities that we used to follow. And this is something that I'm really passionate about because I think it's incredibly useful. So these are the steps that we'd follow to come up with an information architecture and a site structure that we found worked really well for users. So the first thing that we did was a content audit. I won't get into this too much, but essentially a content audit is you got to go and you got to audit the valuable content within your organization that's going to be on your intranet. It doesn't mean you need to audit every single thing, but at least getting an understanding of what content is important. And the reason for that is that the next thing you do is something called a card sort. Now, I'm not sure if anyone has done a card sort within their organization before. It's a super fun exercise. And the idea with this is that it's a user-centered design way to help you understand how people think about content. So the way that this works is you get the top 50 to 80 pieces of content that you want on your intranet, and then you get people to essentially group those things together. Now, traditionally, when we were in person, you would do these with cards. So each thing would be a card and people would put these cards into buckets. Now there's a lot of online tools that you can use. And what this allows you to do is gives you a really good understanding of how do people think about content. So a great example would be, how do people think about forms in your organization? Do they think about, well, we're going to put all of the forms together into a bucket called forms? Or do they actually think about forms in terms of, well, we think about forms in terms of who owns it. So then they, instead of putting all the forms together, they put the forms in a department kind of bucket. That's the type of stuff that you understand, and that's how you can build a really beautiful IA. Steps to prepare for a card sort. So you have to have your content audit done. You get 50, 80 cards. You decide on those top level categories. Now, within a card sort, you can have multiple different things. You can have something called an open card sort where people create whatever they want. You can have a closed card sort also, but once again, you have a whole number of features there. And then at the end of this, you get something called a site structure. So this site structure is this kind of first cut at our navigation structure in terms of the buckets. But once again, we kind of understand how people think about content, but now if we put this through the paces, the structure, how can we make sure that we actually understand, or people understand, There's another tool that you can use, and it's called a tree test. Now, what a tree test does, it used to kind of evaluate the findability of topics on an intranet. So how this works is you put in your navigation into this tool. You basically ask people a set of task-based questions. So one of them could be, you're new to your organization and you're looking for the policy around working from home. Where would you expect to find that? And what people do is they click through these navigation items and they say, yes, I'm going to find that here. This is the best way. And the reason for this is because this is online, you can send this out to one person, you can send it out to everyone within your organization. And then what these tools do as well is they go and they get a whole bunch of information. So you can see exactly on the left-hand side here where users clicked, the paths that they went down. This is really useful because not every user is going to go to the same location. So you can see in some cases where you might have a lot of users going to 2 different locations. That's fine. Maybe you have to change the labels, or maybe what you do is on the landing page there, you have a link to that content from each location there. So at least users, if they get to that page, they can get to that area. You can see how all of the questions scored as well, which is really, really powerful. And then you can also get feedback from participants also, right? So what are these tools? What are these magical things that I'm talking about? Well, they're pretty easy. So let's go into here. Now, these tools, we use tools from these guys. So these guys are called Optimal Workshop. They're an information architecture set of tools. There's 5 tools. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time. The ones that we use are Optimal Sort for card sorting and TreeJack for tree testing. Now, card sorting and tree testing, these are the generic terms. So there's other tools out there that do the same stuff. I don't really know much about them because we only used this Optimal Workshop tool. It's really neat. So if we go into here, let's try a demo. So let's try a demo for, let's do a tree testing one because we don't have too much time. So let's say, for instance, that you want to know if your top level navigation, how you've structured content, are people actually going to be able to find stuff? So how do you do that? Well, what you would do, you would go to this tool, you would input all of your stuff, all of your information architecture into this tool. It's super easy. And then you would give people a set of tasks. So maybe 10 tasks, it may be 12. We found anywhere between 10 to 15 tasks was really, really useful. And the way that it would work from an end user perspective is something like this. So let's try this. So this is their demo thing. I can't show you any customer stuff, obviously, but you can have your branding up here. It's going to say, we're going to ask you a bunch of stuff. You're going to have to find things. So pretty simple, pretty easy. So let's go here. And let's do this. So your son has bought a smartphone and you want him to keep it safe. Makes sense. Where would you look to buy a protective case? So when I click on start here, this would be your information architecture, your first level, your second level, and everything else. And then what users do is they go through here and say, okay, bought a smartphone, you want to keep it safe. Where would you buy a protective case? So what do we think, people? Protective case, cell phones and plan, premium services, cell phones and plans, maybe. Accessories would be the one I think that you would want to get, right? So accessories. So then you say, I'd find it here. But what you can do is you can kind of go to these different areas and maybe you can go down, but this is basically the process that they went through. So we think it's accessories. I will find it here. The second one, suppose you're a Banana.com customer, you want to find lowest cost broadband. Anyway, so you can give people these tasks. They can go through this at their own time. It doesn't have to be in person, but what happens is, from a results perspective, let's click on this. This tool gathers an incredible amount of results through here. How many participants you had, how long it took, where they were from, how many people were successful for each particular task. And it's broken down into direct success. So they went down the shortest path. Indirect is they kind of flailed around the place, but they eventually found it. And then the direct and the indirect failures are the same thing, except on the failure side. But the fantastic thing about this is you could really understand exactly how people are clicking, how people would use your information architecture, how your content is structured, really before you build anything. And our biggest tree test, I think, that we ever did, we got like 4,500 responses. This was a pretty big organization. I think there were about 50,000 people, but a really large organization gave us an incredible amount of data to help us understand how should the structure be, how should the intranet be structured. And that's one of the ways I think that, you know, a lot of customers were super happy. So within each one of these tasks, you get this kind of breakdown. So how long it took, the success and everything else. And you also get my favorite thing called the pie tree. Not just because I like pie, but because it shows you something like this. And let's go into horizontal view. So what this shows you is the paths that people went, right? So most people on the screen line went from the home page to the internet to the home internet plans, the DSL. The question is, you're not a Banana.com customer, would you find the lowest broadband? But you can also see people go to other places, right? And this idea that you can see kind of where people are thinking about things is pretty interesting. So it's interesting that the question is find the lowest cost broadband subscription. Pretty much everyone went to internet, which made sense, but some people went to DSL plans and some people went to 3G broadband, probably because broadband was in the title of the question and it was in that navigation node also. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea in terms of how you can use this tool. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And then finally, in terms of how to prepare for this, let me go to the next slide. Pretty much. So for your tree test, you get your site structure that we created from the card sort, put it into this tool, you review your questions, and then you basically prepare some email communication also. So I know that was a very quick tour throughout information architecture. Hopefully, like I said, that has helped you, particularly those tools. I would definitely have a look at optimal sort and everything else. So that's all I have time for. Let's quickly go and see if there's time for a couple of questions as well through here. Let me move this out of the way. Oops. Let me just move this 1 second here. Okay, perfect. Questions published. Oh, we do have a lot of, let's see, new. Perfect. Okay, so someone asked a question. Oh, so how many users can you run through an information architecture exercise? You can run as many users as you want. It is an automated tool after all, so you don't need to do that. Also. Typically, we find if you can get 10% of an organization, that's pretty good. It's a really great way as well. If you're looking to roll out your intranet, you can use it as a way to do that. Another question, is there a place you can purchase sets of metadata that are common to industries like banking or finance? Good question. There is pre-canned and predetermined taxonomies for particular industries. We found, though, that a lot of them were just overkill. Like you would get 600,000 different terms, right? It would be pretty difficult there also. So there is definitely the opportunity there to buy exact things also as well. Another question, what do I think of SharePoint navigation? Can I use the out of the box? It's definitely better. I am not a huge fan of how the a couple of things that I don't like about the hub navigation in particular. What I showed you previously, where you have like one mega menu and then another mega menu, is not particularly cool from my perspective. The other thing I also found as well is that that hub navigation doesn't really highlight, so you don't really know where you are as an end user, and that drives me crazy. Saying that, there's a lot of other tools out there that you can basically use also. Is it better to have an open or closed card sort when determining your site structure? Okay, so this is someone that knows about card sorting. What I would say is I would have what's called an open card sort. So you wouldn't want to have a closed card sort for your for determining your site structure. Like I said, open card sort, people decide the categories. You can have a mix also. What I would say is you would have an open card sort for your top level navigation items, and you can have a closed card sort for maybe categories of content underneath those items as well. Awesome. Well, listen, everyone, thank you so much for joining me. I know we went through a lot of information and I breezed through a lot of things. Hopefully, like I said, this was really useful for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Love to talk all things the new products coming out and information architecture. Have a fantastic rest of the day and the rest of the conference. And just a huge shout out as well to the conference, all of the conference organizers. They've done this stuff for free. This thing's going like 24/7. There's literally people being stuck in a room. So massive shout out to them. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for having me.